On November 1, 1950, near the Yalu River, a squadron of the U.S. Air Force was attacked by communist fighters that suddenly appeared. The performance of the unfamiliar fighter was so overwhelming that 151 and 180 were shot down in an instant. It was a shocking debut for the MiG-15, representing the first generation of fighters in the Eastern Bloc in the history of fighter jets. The United States had an outstanding opponent at the time, as evidenced by the F-86 hurried deployment to the Korean Peninsula to face this. Nevertheless, the reason this incident was imprinted as a huge shock in the history of weapons was, in fact, because of the United States' generosity. The Soviet Union had already introduced the MiG-15 at events such as the Victory Ceremony and promoted it as the world's best fighter jet. Despite being aware of its existence, the United States was severely hurt. While looking down on the Soviet Union's technological prowess, the United States was so concerned that it declared the best reward for those who drove a MiG-15 to defect to the country to determine its performance. Since this incident, the Soviet Union has firmly established itself as a country that develops and produces a separate standard of fighter jets against the United States. The aftermath is still ongoing. However, the MiG-15 was the time when the Soviet Union, now including Russia, was the most technically equal to the United States in the history of fighter jets. Since then, the competition between the two countries in the field of fighter jets seemed fierce on the surface. But in reality, the Soviet Union was in a hurry to catch up with the United States. In 1959, the United States deployed the F-35 in the era of the third generation of fighter jets. However, in the Vietnam War, the FAR recorded a better-than-expected record in confronting the MiG-17 and MiG-21, the second-generation Soviet fighter jets. Rather, the shooting-down ratio was lower than that of the F-86 during the Korean War. Naturally, the United States was greatly disappointed, but in fact, it was not due to the FAR's poor performance, but to the strange rules of engagement and operational environment that limited the United States' own capabilities. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, surprised by the FAR's performance, hastily started developing new aircraft with out-of-sight combat capabilities, and the MiG-23 was deployed in 1972, allowing it to enter the era of the third generation of fighter jets. There was a 13-year gap, as the proportion of electronics and telecommunications grew thanks to technological advances. It was inevitable that it took more and more time for the Soviet Union to come up with an opponent that could sufficiently compete with US-made fighter jets in terms of performance. In response, the Soviet Union employed an expedient of deployment and problem-solving. It was a kind of trick, and during the Cold War, the United States also bragged about it. But the Soviet Union went too far. Of course, the Soviet Union did not reveal its weaknesses to assert its superiority. At first, the United States was deceived by the Soviet paint movement and did not know it properly. But even after learning the reality, the Soviet Union argued that it was true and that we were weak in order to win as much budget as possible in Congress, a reality that is difficult to narrow down. However, the United States was on the verge of deploying fourth-generation 15 fighter jets when the Soviet Union made its debut with the MiG-23. The Soviet Union, which barely entered the era of third-generation fighter jets, had to pursue the United States without time to breathe. Naturally, the Soviet Union hid this difficult reality and promoted it in a way that it was ahead of the United States. Although it was also the Cold War, the original weapons sector tends to be like that. A case in point is the MiG-25. The MiG-25, which was developed by the Soviet Union as a mainland air defense interceptor around the same time as the MiG-23, was capable of flying at a high speed of Mach 3. Speed was the first indicator of fighter performance. So when the United States first identified the existence of the MiG-25, it was considered a serious threat. It was overreacting because it was severely beaten by the MiG-15 in the Korean War, and the FAR in the Vietnam War showed disappointing results against the MiG-17 and MiG-21. Then the Soviet Union chose a kind of mystical strategy to refrain from disclosing the MiG-25 and deliberately exposed the top speed to NATO air defenses, fueling fear. After analyzing the MiG-25 brought by Viktor Belenko during his exile in 1976, the Soviet Union's black propaganda came to an end. But until just before, the Soviet Union seemed to be sufficiently confronting the United States. As the US became too defensive, however, the Soviet Union mistakenly thought that even if the F-15 made its debut, it would be able to compete with the MiG-23 and MiG-25. However, the air war in the Bekaa Valley that took place during the Fifth Middle East War in 1982 completely destroyed such hope. During the air war for 3 days, Israel deployed more than 80 F-15 fighter jets, while Syria deployed more than 100 MiG-23 fighter jets. As a result, Israel lost only 1 fur plane, while Syria had 85 fur planes shot down. It was once claimed that the E-2 early warning aircraft performed, but it was basically the result of the large difference in fighter performance. In a nutshell, the fourth generation of fighter jets was different. Soviet-made fighter jets also trailed in their ability to fight close up, which they had been proud to be ahead of. The Soviet Union eventually entered the era of the fourth generation of fighter, with the deployment of the Su-27 in 1985, but like déjà vu, the United States had already begun its fifth-generation fighter business. Then the US deployed the F-22 in 2005, ushering in a new era. Even though the production line has already been shut down, the F-22 is considered to be the most powerful fighter jet. On the other hand, when the F-22 was deployed, Russia started its fifth-generation fighter jet business and was able to deploy the Su-57 in 2020. As such, the Soviet Union's moves in the field of fighter jets so far are a history that shows the agony of a person who cannot give up despite hardships. As seen in the war in Ukraine, Russia's hostile, anti-Western consciousness from the enacted Russia remains such a pattern of challenges, and responses will surely be repeated in the coming era of the sixth generation of fighter jets. It is possible to see them never stop walking, even though they may have reduced their stride in relation to weapons. Even during the chaos of the Soviet Union, a superpower at the end of the 20th century, and Russia's economy was heading into the abyss.